All right, let's talk about promises. We make them all the time, right? Business deals, personal commitments, the whole shebang. But what happens when someone breaks their word? I mean, how do you put a price tag on a broken promise? That's what we're digging in today. The really fascinating economics of contract law. And you'll see, it's not just about punishment. It's about what makes our whole world of cooperation, well, work.
So to really get this, we've got to go back in time to one of the most famous cases ever in contract law. It's about this young guy, George Hawkins. See, he had this scarred hand from an accident when he was a kid. And his family doctor, well, he makes this huge promise. He says he can operate and, get this, he would restore the hand to perfection. A perfect hand. Imagine hearing that.
Yeah, you can probably guess this didn't end well. The operation? It was a total disaster. I mean, a catastrophe. The doctor took a skin graft from Hawkins' chest, and it started growing hair on the palm of his hand. So now the hand wasn't just not perfect, it was, well, it was a hairy hand. Way, way worse than before. That promise for a perfect hand was just shattered.
Okay, so now you're the judge. What do you do? This is way more than just paying for the medical bills, right? How on earth do you put a number on the difference between the original scarred hand and this new hairy hand? Even crazier, how do you measure the gap between that hairy hand and the perfect hand he was promised? This right here is the puzzle at the very core of contract law. Now, before we figure out how to pay Hawkins, let's zoom out for a second. Why does the law even care about promises between people? Why get involved at all? Well, the economic reason is actually pretty simple and super important. It all comes down to making our commitments credible.
Think about it. The whole point from an economic view is to help us trust each other enough to work together on big things. You know, stuff that takes time. Without a legal system to back up those promises, who would ever risk making a long-term investment or a complicated deal? It'd be chaos. So contract law is basically the foundation of trust that lets us build things and create value as a team.
All right, let's get back to poor George Hawkins and his hairy hand problem. So the court has to figure out how to make this right. And to do that, they've basically got three main tools in their toolkit. Three different ways to calculate the damage that was done.
First on the list is something called expectation damages. This is the big one, the most common way to handle it. The whole idea here is to give the victim the benefit of the bargain. So the court asks a simple question. Where would George Hawkins be today if that doctor had actually kept his promise and delivered that perfect hand?
So the math for this is all about the promise. A court has to somehow figure out the dollar value of a perfect hand and then subtract the dollar value of the hairy hand he ended up with. That gap? That's what he expected to get from the deal. And that's what the doctor owes him.
Okay, method number 2, reliance damages. This one's totally different. It's like trying to build a time machine. The goal isn't to give him the benefit of the promise, but to rewind the clock and put him back in the exact spot he was in before the promise was ever made, as if he never shook the doctor's hand on the deal.
And you can see how the math changes here, right? We're not even thinking about that perfect hand anymore. Instead, we're comparing the value of his original scarred hand to the value of the hairy hand he got stuck with. This is just about covering the damage that was done because he relied on that broken promise.
And finally, there's a third way to look at this, called opportunity cost damages. This one asks a really interesting question. What did Hawkins give up to take this deal? You know, maybe there was another, better surgeon he could have gone to. This tries to put him in the same position he would be in if he'd just taken his next best option instead.
So when you line these three up, how do they compare? Well, typically, expectation damages are gonna be the biggest payout. It makes sense, right? It includes the entire profit or benefit from the deal. And reliance damages are usually the smallest, since they're just trying to undo the harm. It creates this really clear, well, a hierarchy of damages.
Okay, so far this has all been about money, about writing a check to fix the problem. But what if the thing you were promised is totally unique, like one of a kind? You can't just go out and buy another one. This is where the law has to pull out some different tools.
Courts basically have two main paths they can take. For stuff that's, replaceable, like a load of wheat or a brand new car, they just award money. That's damages. But for things you can't replace, a specific house, a famous painting, a family heirloom. They can do something way more powerful.
And it's called specific performance. This isn't about money anymore. This is a direct order, a command from the court. It says to the person who broke the promise, you are going to do exactly what you said you would do. Hand over the painting, sign over the deed to the house. It literally forces them to keep their promise. And there are a couple of other tools in that toolkit. One is simple, restitution. It just means you have to give back whatever you got, like a down payment. But then there's this other one, disgorgement, which is really cool. It forces the promise breaker to give up any profit they made from being shady and hand it over to the person they wronged. Okay, now we're going to get into one of the wildest, most counterintuitive ideas in this whole field. Normally, we think breaking a promise is just wrong, right? A moral failing. But what if I told you that from a pure economic point of view, breaking a contract could sometimes be the right thing to do, the efficient thing?
Just imagine this for a second. Let's say you agree to sell your house. You've signed the papers, everything's moving along. Then, out of the blue, someone else shows up and offers you a ton more money for it. This is what economists call a fortunate contingency. And man, does it create a dilemma.
So here's how this crazy idea can actually work. You break the first contract. Yep, you heard me. You sell the house to the person who offered more money. Then you go back to that first buyer and you pay them their full expectation damages. You cover every penny of profit they lost out on. Now step back and look at what happened. The first buyer is made whole financially. You're way better off, and the house ends up with the person who values it the most. Economically speaking, everybody wins. This is what they call an efficient breach. And this completely changes how you think about damages, doesn't it? They're not a punishment. They're a price. The price of exiting a deal. It's a system that allows things like that house to move to where they're valued the most, which makes the whole economy better off. So, since we know all this, people can actually get ahead of the game and write their own remedies directly into the contract. They can say, hey, if one of us breaks this deal, here's the exact amount that has to be paid. That's called liquidated damages. But there is a catch. The courts really don't like clauses that are just there to punish somebody. If it looks like a penalty instead of a reasonable guess at the actual damage, a judge will probably throw it out. Which leaves us with a really tough final question to chew on. If a contract is really just about efficiency, does that mean you should be able to buy your way out of any promise you ever make? What happens to things like morality and trust and just the value of your word if everything has a price? That tension between economic logic and human promises is right at the very heart of why this stuff is so important.